Now let's go on to section 2 and 3 of the poem In Memory of W.B. Yeats. Section 2 is just one small stanza of 10 lines. This is how it goes. You were silly like us. Your gift survived it all. The parish of rich women, physical decay, yourself. Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. Now Ireland has a madness and her weather still, for poetry makes nothing happen. It survives in the valley of its making, where executives would never want to tamper. Flows on south from ranches of isolation and busy griefs, raw towns that we believe and die in. It survives, a way of happening, a mouth. So here too, I am going to attempt an interpretation which I have derived at after reading a few explanations on this and from what I understand. You were silly like us, he says right at the beginning. Now, who is this you here? It is W.B. Yeats. Now, the poet is talking, it is as if he is addressing Yeats and says, you were silly like us, means you were a human being like any one of us. You had all the follies and foibles that any of us have. Okay, you were silly like us. Your gift survived it all. But then you had a gift. And that gift survived, or it kind of outlived you, the person. So your gift survived it all. You were silly like us. Your gift survived it all. The parish of rich women. Now he gives us a list of a few of Yeats's weaknesses. A parish of rich women. Now Yeats was immensely popular when he was alive as a poet. As I told you in the beginning, that he was very, very active in the intellectual circles of Dublin and Ireland. He had a lot of followers, and he had a lot of women also who were his great admirers. And the chief among them was Maud Gonne. He considered her to be his muse or his inspiration for many of his poems. The woman called Maud Gonne, who was considered to be very beautiful, and he was very much in love with Maud Gonne, but Maud never reciprocated the feelings of love. Instead, she fell in love with somebody else and got married to that man too. But Yeats continued to be very, very obsessed with her. And so here it is said that everybody knows all these things about Yeats, that he was always surrounded by a lot of rich women, because that is the kind of circles in which Yeats kind of was involved in. He belonged to the elite class in society, and he was not really involved with the poorer classes. And so he was always surrounded by these rich and influential women. And then what happened later was physical decay. He lost his health and he slowly started deteriorating physically. And then yourself, that is, this person called W.B. Yeats was a man with a lot of faults and with a lot of weaknesses. So in spite of all this, because of this one gift that he possessed, he was able to survive. So that's what he means by, you were silly like us, your gift survived it all, the parish of rich women, physical decay, yourself, but you were able to come out of all this. And then he says, Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. Now Ireland has a madness and her weather still, for poetry makes nothing happen. So he says, Mad Ireland. Why does he call Ireland mad? Because Ireland was always in a frenzy. Ireland was having a lot of trouble with England, and the Irish people were fighting for their independence from England. They wanted to be free of this control of England, and so there was always some trouble or the other in Ireland, and the Irish people were very passionate about their freedom. They often rose in rebellion. And so the relationship between Ireland and England was highly turbulent. And that is why he says, Mad Ireland. Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry, because Yeats personally was a pacifist who did not believe in war or who did not believe in revolt and rebellion. And again, there was this instance of him being asked to write a poem about the war, because he definitely lived through the First World War, and he died just at the beginning of the Second World War. And after the first one, he was asked to write a poem about war, and he refused because he was against warfare. And on being pressed to write the poem, he wrote a poem titled "On Being Asked to Write a War Poem." And in that poem, he kind of is quite angry. It's a very short poem in which he kind of angrily says that poets, or the so-called the artists and such people, do not really have a role in deciding what happens in a country. Nobody really listens to them. Only some young women or old men might pay attention to poets. Otherwise, what importance does a poet have? So that is all that he wrote in that poem. And so he was always against such activities. And in Ireland too, he did not exactly support the Irish rebellion. And he has written a very famous poem called Easter 1916, which was occasioned, or which was inspired by the Easter Rising of 1916. And even in that poem, we can sense he doesn't really support what the Irish rebels did. So mad, but in spite of that, he wrote poems about Ireland and the struggle of the Irish people. So that is what is meant here when we say that Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. He was forced to write some poems because of what was happening in Ireland. And then he says, now Ireland still continues to be mad, and her weather, she still has her cold weather, but you are no more. Okay, so why does he say that? It becomes clear in the next line. For poetry makes nothing happen. So he tells us that, he tells Yeats, you wrote about Ireland, the madness of Ireland forced you to write a few poems on Ireland, but then what has happened? Nothing has come out of those poems, because Ireland still continues to be mad. Her weather still hasn't changed. Your weather might be the real weather, the coldness, or maybe the temperament of the Irish people. They are still in a very frenzied mood. Nothing has changed because of your poetry. So now this question, what is the function of poetry? Does poetry really have a role to play in society? Because we always hear that literature can change people, literature can refine a person. And sometimes we blame literature and movies for spoiling people. So is this really possible? So the question is this, because here Auden says, for poetry makes nothing happen. It's as if he is denouncing, maybe he is bitter. Many of the poets those days, and I told you earlier how he left England and went off to the US just before the World War started. So maybe he was angry at what was happening in the world around. He did not want wars and such things, but it was still happening. And so it must have been the same helplessness that Yeats felt when he wrote the poem on being asked to write a war poem. That's exactly what Auden too must have felt. It is, I guess, that bitterness that comes out in these lines, and especially when he says, for poetry makes nothing happen. And then the next few lines are devoted to poetry as such. What is poetry? He tries to give us a definition of poetry and its origin. So I'll just give you a summary of that. Now, it survives. It here is poetry. And he says poetry it survives in a valley, means in the sense that poetry springs from somewhere deep within us, within a poet, within the mind, the recesses of the poet's mind. There is some inexplorable kind of a place from where poetry arises, and it flows through a valley where nobody can tamper, where executives would never want to tamper, where, in the sense, I guess, nobody can really tell us where exactly this place is or what happens in that place. So it is from this unknown, very deep place that poetry starts or wells up or springs in a person, and it flows on south from ranches of isolation and the busy griefs. Means poetry then it kind of gathers or gains a lot of insights and inputs from the experiences as we grow, as we live through various experiences. Our poetry is enriched because we get more ideas, we get more experiences. So that's why he says flows on south from ranches of isolation and the busy griefs. So ranch, you know what a ranch is? It's a farm. It's a kind of a farm usually where some animals are bred, like you have horse ranches, you have cattle ranches, wide acres of land. And so ranches of isolation. So through experiences of isolation, through experiences of spending time with other people, you sometimes experience griefs. Raw towns again, town doesn't exactly mean a town as such. It means experiences through which a person passes. Just like, life is a journey, or a river. Here life is a river, and the river is on a journey. The river might pass through many places. It passes through ranches, it passes through busy places, it passes through towns. And so all these various experiences makes your poetry what it is. So every individual poet is nourished and is fed by his imagination is fed by his own experiences and his own conceptions of the world. And it survives a way of happening a mouth. So no matter what happens, a poem or poetry continues to survive. So here the poet Yeats is no more, he is dead, but his poetry continues to survive, and it remains as a mouth in the sense it remains as the voice of a person, of the writer. It continues to speak for him though he has left this world. So in that section 2, he is mainly he's not really talking about Yeats the man. That's why I told you right at the beginning that this is a very unconventional elegy, because he is talking about various things as the poem progresses, not just about the man called Yeats. In this stanza, he is discussing the idea of poetry as such. What is poetry? What role does it play? Does it play any role at all? Okay, so that is the idea discussed in section 2. Now let's go on to section 3. Here we have 6 stanzas, 4 lines each. And here we also have rhyme in these stanzas. The rhyme scheme is AABB. Okay, guest, rest, lie, poetry, dark, bark, wait, hate. So AABB is the rhyme scheme of this last section. Now stanza 1 of section 3, he is talking to the earth and he's telling her, earth, receive an honored guest. William Yeats is laid to rest. Let the Irish vessel lie emptied of its poetry. So the earth is informed that you're going to have a guest. Please receive him with great honor. Your guest is none other than the poet William Yeats. So for the first time in the poem, he mentions the name of Yeats. And he says that he is an honored guest because he was a great poet. He was much acclaimed and renowned all over the world. And so he is definitely an honored guest. And then let the Irish vessel lie emptied of its poetry. Irish vessel, because Yeats was Anglo-Irish in origin, and so his body is Irish. That's why Irish vessel. Again, you can see the detachment between the poet and how he keeps himself detached from Yeats the man. He talks about Yeats's body as a vessel, and this vessel was full of poetry, but since his soul has left him, the vessel is now empty, and it has been emptied of its poetry. His poetry survives elsewhere, but here it's just the body alone. So let the Irish vessel lie emptied of its poetry. The next stanza: in the nightmare of the dark, all the dogs of Europe bark, and the living nations wait, each sequestered in its hate. So then he goes on to a very totally different picture. He says that there is a nightmare going on in the rest of the world. There is darkness, and you can hear a lot of dogs barking. He gives us a very horrifying and a very sinister kind of a picture. What is he referring to? We have to think of the times when this person was alive. It was the time when Second World War was impending. Any day a war might break out, and we also know that the World War was highly destructive. It was so bloody, and it claimed the lives of millions of people. And so he says that in the nightmare of the dark, so I guess he's talking about this scenario of the war, the dogs of the Europe bark. Now what can that mean? Now we know that the barking of dogs at night, especially when they howl, a long frightening howl that makes your hair stand on end, that kind of a howl of a dog usually is associated with something evil going to happen. Even we in India believe that when dogs start howling like that, it is because the dogs can see death approaching. So when there is a dying person, somebody who's sick and dying, when the dogs start howling, the people at home, they start getting panicked because they believe that death is approaching. So here the nightmare of the dark, I guess, symbolizes the war that is soon to break out. And the dogs of Europe, again, the dogs of Europe barking may also refer to all these power-hungry leaders who were kind of clamoring for war, like Hitler, Mussolini, and some of the leaders in Britain, in France, in the States, who were all, kind of waiting for the war to break out, because a war is usually a decision of the higher ups, the officers, the presidents, and the prime ministers, and such people. And so maybe he is referring to all those people. And the living nations wait, each sequestered in its hate. The living nations, the various nations like Britain, France, Germany, Italy, each sequestered in its hate. You can see a divided world there, very disturbing picture. Sequestered means sheltered. Generally, we use the word sequestered to talk about the nuns in a convent who lead a very sequestered life, sheltered. They do not indulge in any kind of relations with others. They do not have any love relationships or any kind of friendships outside the convent. So their lives are sequestered, cloistered, kept away from all the others. But here sequestered means that each nation is kind of cut off from the other, separated from the other. By what? Separated by what? By hate. That's what is most disturbing, because everybody hates the others, in the sense that Britain hates Germany, Germany hates Britain, France hates Germany, and like that they are all cut off and by their hatred and animosity towards each other. So that's why I said it's a very, very disturbing picture that he's giving us here. Intellectual disgrace stares from every human face, and the seas of pity lie locked and frozen in each eye. Okay, now this, let's see how we can interpret this. Intellectual disgrace stares from every human face. So when I read this, I believe that Auden is expressing the same helplessness and a kind of anger, frustration at not being able to do anything about the war. many writers of those days, there was this very famous essayist called Joad, C-E-M, Joad, who also wrote vehemently against war. He refused to take part in the war. He declared himself to be a pacifist, and he spoke about Gandhi and Gandhi's non-violence policy, and he believed that peace can be attained through through ahimsa or non-violent methods. So all on civil disobedience movements. Many of the writers, the writers in the sense, all these sensitive people and people who could see things for what they really were, who did not have any selfish aims guiding them, all of them could understand. It was very obvious that a war is not good for a nation, for any nation for that matter of fact. What good does a war actually bring? Who benefits from a war? Maybe in the annals of history you can record that this country won a war, that country won a war. But other than that, what good does it do? Because it takes away people from their loved ones. Families lose their fathers, their husbands, their brothers, their sons. So then it traumatizes millions of people who are involved. So what good does a war ultimately bring is a question. So many, now if you have come across war poets like Wilfred Owen, some of you must have read the poem Strange Meeting by Auden. And there Owen was actually a soldier. He took part in the war, and it is when he took part in the war that he realized and experienced the horrors of war. And then he started writing against the war. But even when Owen wrote against war, he painted a very stark picture of war, and he told the others that war is a bad thing. There is nothing glorious in war. There is nothing romantic about a war. So even Wilfred Owen, who experienced the difficulties of war, who knew that it was futile, even he continued to fight for his country, and he died in battle. And so that is maybe that is because in a country which is at war, when you try to tell the rest of the people that war is not good, they would consider you a coward, they would consider you a traitor. So this must have held back many people who in their heart of hearts knew that indulging in war is not right. So maybe that frustration was experienced by Auden too. And coming back to the poem, intellectual disgrace stares from every human face, and the seas of pity lie locked and frozen in each eye. So he says that he feels disgraced when a person looks at his face. He sees a question there. He sees the question, you are all intellectuals, you are all poets who understand life well, who can see ahead of time. Why isn't that you are doing nothing to stop war? Why can't you preach and teach the lessons of love instead of hatred? So maybe he reads all these questions in the eye of the person standing in front of him, and that is why he feels disgraced, because a civilized nation would never indulge in such barbarian activities as a war. So intellectual disgrace stares from every human face. So when I say people, I refer to people who are sensible, who have such thoughts, who agree that war is bad. So when such people meet each other and when they look into each other's eyes, they are disgraced, they are ashamed because they are not able to stop such atrocities. And in each eye, he can see the seas of pity lie locked and frozen. So everybody feels pity for themselves, pity for others, pity for the soldiers, pity for the family of the soldiers who lose their lives or become maimed. All that is there. But what has happened to this pity? The pity is locked and frozen in the eye. Means nobody is ready to act on it. They feel it, but they never reveal it, for fear of being scorned by the rest of the people. So I guess it is that helplessness that is expressed here. And then in the next stanza he says, follow poet, follow, right to the bottom of the night, with your unconstraining voice, still persuade us to rejoice. With the farming of a verse, make a vineyard of the curse, sing of human unsuccess in a rapture of distress. In the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountain start, in the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise. So I have read the next 3 stanzas at a stretch because they seem to be connected in their theme. So he tells Yeats, follow poet, follow, right to the bottom of the night. So he, I guess, is addressing Yeats, or he might be addressing all poets in general. He says that continue to explore the depths of the night and continue to persuade us to rejoice. Unconstraining voice, we know that even death cannot really stop poetry. Even after Yeats is dead and gone, his poetry continues. That is why unconstraining voice. So he requests the poet, and poet Yeats and all the other poets, he requests them to continue exploring the depths of the human mind and the evil and the good, and continue to write poems that would give us something to rejoice. And with the farming of a verse, make a vineyard of the curse. Now, curse, I guess, is war and hatred and evil which we have in this world. So a poet can bring out something good out of it. Like sometimes we know that poems are like, for instance, war poetry. War poetry was inspired by war. So war is essentially a bad thing, but then good poetry came out of that war. Same way, war can sing of human unsuccess in the rapture of distress. So see, a war, though it is bad, can essentially bring out some goodness. We hear stories about soldiers who readily sacrifice their life to save somebody else. We hear stories of a soldier who even helped his enemy who was in trouble. Even in the World War, you hear of a lot of such stories. Because essentially, even in the Strange Meeting, Wilfred Owen, he killed the other man who was a German soldier, and they two meet in a world after death. There is no animosity or enmity between the two of them, because beyond being a German or an Englishman, they are human beings. 2 young men with a lot of dreams and a lot of aspirations in life, but whose lives have been cut short untimely. And so a war also brings out a lot of goodness in human beings. So maybe he is telling the poets to write poems, even if it stems from this curse called hatred or war, they can still write about good things and inspire people, give us some kind of a happiness. In the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountain start. So deserts of the heart, in the sense the heart that has gone barren with hatred and with violence, with so much of bloodshed, even there we can hope to start a fountain of love. In the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise. So here each man is kind of imprisoned in his own world, his own ideologies, his own attitudes. So through your poetry, try to give some cause for happiness, try to inspire people, try to heal the wounded hearts. So that is how the poem ends. In the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountain start. In the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise. How to praise, I guess what he means is teach people how to find goodness even amidst evil. Let people, show them how to find happiness even amidst so much of misery and sorrow. That is how I interpret these lines. So now I am done with the explanation of the poem, and just to talk about the themes of this particular poem, what would you say are the themes? One definitely is death, because it is an elegy and he is actually mourning the death of a person. Here Auden is mourning the death of Yeats, but then as different from other poems belonging to this genre, he doesn't have a list of mourners, or he doesn't say that all the flowers and nature is mourning and all that. But of course nature is mentioned. He says that everything was cold that day. The river, the brooks were frozen. So the image of nature also joining in, we can maybe say that is there in that frozen, the snow and the frozen brooks and the coldness. So death is one theme, death of this man called Yeats, and how he slowly succumbed to death, that is there. And then we also have this image of flowing water. You saw how poetry is compared to a river that kind of springs from somewhere deep within, and then it flows through various experiences, and it becomes the voice of this person, the poet, and this voice continued to flow and to live even after the death of the poet. He talks about how the life current slowly ebbs away from his body. And then yet another theme was this theme of how life goes on. No matter what happens, no matter who dies, life goes on. Only the ones who are closely associated with the person are affected by death. Death is a phenomenon that is a part of life, and it doesn't really deserve undue kind of importance. So that attitude is also there. And then again he raises questions about poetry, the function of poetry, what role does it play. So such things too are discussed in this poem. So I guess that is all I have to tell you about the poem In Memory of W.B. Yeats.